kind of amazing, isn't it? Thinking that over 200 different cultures all over the world have these stories about a massive flood.
It really does make you pause, yeah. It speaks to something fundamental about maybe our collective experience with nature's power.
Absolutely. And, well, speaking of floods, you sent over this incredible stack of material on Noah's Ark. I mean, everything from religious texts, ancient ones, to the latest scientific takes.
That's right.
So that's exactly where we're diving in today.
Yeah, precisely. Because this isn't just, a simple story. What you've gathered lets us really look at Noah's Ark from all these angles, religious, historical, scientific. It's a proper cross-section.
It really is. And the sources are so varied. We're pulling from this comprehensive study, Kajian Comprehensive Tentang Nabi Nuh As, which itself draws on, well, the Quran, the Tanakh, the Bible.
Archaeology, geology, and like you said, all those global myths.
Exactly. So the plan for this deep dive is basically to unpack the main stories, the key findings from, all these perspectives.
And hopefully give everyone listening a clear, sort of structured way to understand what can be a pretty complex topic. Connect the dots a bit, maybe spark some aha moments.
Without getting totally bogged down in detail.
Right. We'll pull out the most interesting bits from your research.
Okay, let's start with the religious views then. They're really the bedrock for so much of this. Your stuff breaks it down by faith, so maybe start with Islam. The Quranic view of Nuh, peace be upon him.
Okay, so what jumps out immediately in the Quran is how central Nuh is as a prophet, a really major figure. And it mentions he preached monotheism for this incredibly long time.
1,000 years less, 50 years.
Exactly, 950 years. That duration itself really highlights his dedication, his perseverance.
For sure. That huge time frame, it really puts the focus on his preaching, doesn't it? The constant rejection he faced and how the flood is framed as, well, divine punishment for that disbelief.
Yeah, for turning away from that core message of one God.
And it's not just an abstract punishment either. The Quran makes it very personal, very tragic.
It really does. That story about one of Nuh's own sons refusing to get on the ark, thinking he'd be safe on a mountain, and drowning anyway, despite Nuh pleading with him, that's in Surah Hud. It's heartbreaking.
It is. It shows the cost of disbelief, even right inside his family.
Right. And then, after the flood, the Quran says the ark settled on Mount Judy.
You included the original Arabic and a translation of that verse, Surah Hud 11.44. It mentions the earth swallowing water, the sky holding back rain, and the ship resting on Al-Judi.
Astawat ala Judi. Yes. And Islamic tradition places Judy in northern Mesopotamia, what's now the Kurdistan region.
Interesting.
What's also quite distinct is that the Quran doesn't give, the specific number of days for the flood like other texts do.
Okay. So the focus stays on the lesson.
Exactly. The moral, the spiritual takeaway, the warning, the salvation of believers. It seems maybe that focus on meaning over, say, technical specs is key to the Quranic narrative here.
That makes sense. It shifts the emphasis. And Islam also views Nuh as this deeply grateful servant, right? It pushes back against stories found elsewhere, like the one about him getting drunk.
Definitely. Those are seen as distortions. The Quran calls him a grateful servant, which really shapes the whole picture of his character in Islam. Steadfast, faithful, appreciative of God's mercy.
Got it. Okay, so now let's pivot to Judaism. The Tanakh, the Torah, the story of Nuh, or Noah. Similarities, but also some key differences, I gather.
Yes, absolutely. So Genesis chapter 6 to 9, this part is so central it gets its own name, Parsha Noach, in the weekly readings.
Right.
And the Tanakh really highlights why Noah was chosen. Genesis 6.9, Noah was a righteous man, blameless among his contemporaries. Noah walked with God. It sets him apart from this corrupt world.
So his righteousness is the key factor.
Precisely. And unlike the Quran's focus, the Tanakh gives these really specific instructions for building the ark. Dimensions are laid out 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 high.
That gives you a real sense of scale, doesn't it? A massive project.
Huge. And then there's the command about the animals. Pairs of all creatures, yes, but a distinction is made.
The clean and unclean animals.
Right. 7 pairs of the clean, just 1 pair of the unclean. That's Genesis 7.2-3. A detail not in the Quran.
Why that difference, do we think?
Well, it likely ties into the sacrificial laws and practices that are established later, after the flood. It seems unique to the Judeo-Christian context at this point.
Okay. And the Tanakh also gives a more detailed timeline for the flood itself.
Much more specific. 40 days and nights of rain, then the waters prevailing for 150 days. A very defined period.
Wow, okay. And the landing spot?
Genesis 8.4 is explicit. Upon the mountains of Ararat, Your source even has the Hebrew al-Hara arada.
So a clear geographical reference there, contrasting with Judy in the Quran.
A very clear marker, yes. And the Tanakh continues with those memorable details, sending out the raven, then the dove.
The dove returning with the olive leaf. Such a powerful image.
Isn't it? A symbol of hope, of receding waters that's just lasted millennia.
Absolutely. A universal symbol of peace now. And the Tanakh is also clear about who survived, right?
Yes. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. 8 people total. That's another point of difference with the Quranic version regarding the family.
Okay, 8 people. And then comes the covenant.
The covenant, exactly. Symbolized by the rainbow. Genesis 9, God promises never again to destroy all life with a flood. The rainbow is that visible sign.
Still powerful today. Now, your notes mentioned something about the rabbinic view, that maybe Noah wasn't seen quite as positively compared to someone like Abraham.
Right, that's a fascinating nuance in some Jewish thought. While he's praised for his obedience, some interpretations suggest he maybe didn't argue for his generation, didn't intercede enough, unlike Abraham did later for Sodom. It shows different ways of thinking about righteousness.
Interesting. And then there's that episode, unique to the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Ah, yes. The story of Noah's drunkenness and the cursing of Ham's descendants. Genesis 9.2a25.
Which is completely absent in the Quran.
Completely. Given the Quran's portrayal of Nuh's high moral standing, its absence really highlights the different theological paths these traditions took.
It really does show how the same core story can be viewed through very different lenses. Okay, so let's move to Christianity. How does the Bible approach Noah?
Well, Christianity obviously builds heavily on the Old Testament account in Genesis, but the New Testament adds layers of theological meaning.
Right, like Hebrews 11.7,
Yeah.
emphasizing Noah's faith. By faith, Noah built an ark. He becomes this prime example of faith in action.
Exactly. The New Testament often uses Old Testament figures to illustrate key Christian concepts.
And Jesus himself refers to Noah.
He does, yeah. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus talks about the days of Noah, how the flood came unexpectedly as a parallel to the end times.
Linking it to eschatology, the end times, emphasizing readiness.
Right. Luke 17, it makes this ancient event relevant to future expectations.
And there's symbolism too. The flood and the ark.
Definitely. The Apostle Peter in 1 Peter chapter 3 actually compares the floodwaters to baptism and the ark to salvation.
8 in all were saved through water, and this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also.
Precisely. So the ark becomes a type, a symbol of salvation through faith, sometimes linked to the church itself.
That adds a whole other layer of meaning. And Christianity also agrees on the number of survivors.
Yes, aligns with the Tanakh, 8 people. Again, differing from the Quran on that specific point about the family.
And the drunkenness episode.
Acknowledged in Christian tradition, yes, though how it's interpreted can vary. But the rainbow, like in Judaism, remains that potent symbol of God's promise.
So looking across the 3, we have this shared core story, but with really distinct interpretations and points of focus. Your source had that helpful table summarizing things.
Yeah, highlighting differences like the family's fate, the landing spot Judy versus Ararat.
The level of detail and duration, arc specifics, and Noah's role as a preacher being much stronger in the Quran.
It's interesting to see where the emphasis lies, isn't it? Quran, the prophetic call, consequences of rejection, Tanakh, covenant, new beginnings, Christianity, faith, salvation, end times.
But beneath those differences, the basic building blocks are remarkably similar.
They really are. Righteous hero, divine warning, a vessel, a flood as judgment, salvation for a few plus animals, a fresh start for humanity.
Which makes you wonder about where these shared themes came from.
Absolutely. And as the source material points out, these elements echo even older stories from Mesopotamia.
Like the Epic of Gilgamesh and Atrahasis.
Exactly. Pre-Abrahamic myths with a hero, a warning, a boat, animals, survival, repopulation. Parallels are just undeniable. Suggests a shared origin or maybe influence down the line.
It really does seem interconnected. Your source mentions the Islamic view Quran confirming earlier truths but correcting perceived distortions, and also the historical critical idea.
That Genesis might have drawn on those Mesopotamian tales, maybe during the Babylonian exile.
It's all incredibly interwoven.
It is, which leads us neatly into the historical and archaeological side. Did a huge flood or maybe a massive regional flood actually happen, and where might that ark have landed?
Right, Ararat versus Judy, that's the big geographical question. Ararat in eastern Turkey, near Armenia.
And Judy further southeast, closer to Iraq and Syria. Both have strong traditions.
Ararat's definitely more famous in the west. There's that claim about Nakhichevan at its base being Noah's burial place.
Yeah, and even Josephus, back in the 1st century, mentioned locals believing Ark remnants were still up there.
And people have been looking for centuries. That Russian pilot sighting in 1916, the Ararat anomaly, photos from 49, though nothing concrete.
Right, lots of claims, little proof. And then there was that big splash in 2010, the NAMI group finding supposed wooden chambers high up.
Yeah, dated to about 4,800 years ago. Caused quite a stir.
It did, but as your source carefully explains, that's been pretty thoroughly debunked since then. Widely seen as a hoax now.
Evidence the wood might have been planted there, a real cautionary tale.
Definitely shows the challenges. And you've got other sites like Pinar, that boat-shaped rock formation.
Which turned out to be natural geology.
Exactly. Plus, Ararat itself is just incredibly difficult to research. Extreme weather, glaciers, politics.
So, no conclusive proof from Ararat so far.
Not really. Now, Mount Judy. Less famous maybe in the West, but very significant in Islam, the Quran names it.
And it's closer to ancient Mesopotamia, geographically.
Right. And it doesn't have those permanent glaciers like Ararat, which you could argue might affect preservation, though that's debatable either way.
But there's historical backing for Judy, early Christian and Jewish traditions pointing there too.
Yes. Syrian, Christian, Babylonian Jewish traditions, and that town name, Thamanin, supposedly meaning 8.
Possibly hinting at the survivors.
Intriguing.
It is, and early Arab historians wrote about it, some claiming wood lasted for centuries. Plus, the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius visited in the 7th century.
And there was a monastery on top until around the 8th century.
Yeah, Gertrude Bell even photographed ruins there early last century. So there's a long documented association.
But modern research is limited there too, due to conflict. Largely, yes. And like Ararat, no ancient wood confirmed yet. But that linguistic link, Judy, Gordian, the Syriac Cardu, used in some old Genesis translations.
That's fascinating. It suggests a connection in naming, at least.
It does, and Dr. Mikhail had that theory trying to bridge the gap, suggesting Judy might have been a peak within a broader ancient Ararat region.
Possible that ancient geography terms were different.
Could be. So, bottom line, both are candidates. Ararat is famous but lacks proof. Judy has historical weight, but less modern exploration. It's still an open question.
Okay, so the Ark's location is uncertain. But what about evidence for a massive flood itself in that region?
Right. That takes us to archaeology. Woolley's excavations at back in the 20s and 30s, he found those thick silt layers.
Dated around 3,800 BC, initially thought to be the flood.
Initially, yes. Huge excitement. But now generally seen as evidence of a major, but localized, Euphrates flood around still devastating but regional.
And other sites, Churuppak, Kish.
Yeah, evidence there of big floods around 2900 BC. And that time frame kind of lines up with the Sumerian king list mentioning a great flood that interrupted dynasties.
Suggesting a real historical memory of a massive flood around then.
It strongly suggests major regional flooding in Mesopotamia, late 3rd millennium BC, not global, but catastrophic for people living there, could easily be the seed for later stories.
And wasn't there also the Black Sea theory?
Ryan and Titman's hypothesis, yeah. Around 5600 BC, Mediterranean bursting into the Black Sea basin.
How does that hold up now?
Well, the scale might have been revised down a bit from their initial idea, but there's still good evidence for a significant inundation, flooding a large area, maybe 2,000 square kilometers.
Still a huge event for anyone living there.
Absolutely. Would have dramatically impacted coastal communities, potentially adding to that pool of flood memories.
So the science doesn't back a literal planet-wide flood in human times.
No geological evidence for that.
But strong evidence for massive regional floods in the right places and times to potentially inspire these stories.
Exactly, which flows perfectly into the scientific view and the global mythology perspective. It's just incredible how widespread these flood stories are.
It really is. Over 200 myths documented. You mentioned Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia, Manu in Hinduism.
Gunyu in China, Aboriginal Australian legends, countless stories from the Americas. It's almost universal.
And when you look closer, the same patterns keep popping up. Gilgamesh's hero, Utnapishtim, gets a warning, builds a boat, saves family, animals, sends birds.
The parallels are uncanny.
Or Manu in India, warned by Vishnu as a fish, builds a boat, saves seeds and sages, lands on a mountain. Same core elements.
Even in China, you have Fuxi and Nuwa surviving a flood in a gourd or ark, then repopulating the earth. Echoes of Mesopotamia again.
And the Greek story, Deucalion and Pyrrha.
Warned by Prometheus, build an ark or chest, survive, repopulate using stones. Again, warning vessel survival, new beginning.
What's really stunning are those Aboriginal Australian stories. Your source said they contain accurate details about sea level rise from thousands of years ago.
Yeah, it's incredible. Oral traditions preserving memory of coastal changes dating back 7,000, even 11,000 years. Shows the power of storytelling.
Just amazing. And then the Americas Aztec, Maya, North American tribes like Cheyenne, Arapaho, Cree, flood survival stories everywhere.
And across all these vastly different cultures, you see those recurring themes. Divine warning, a chosen survivor, often with family, saving animals, a vessel, water covering everything, a set duration, actions after landing like offerings, repopulation, and usually some moral reason for the flood.
Why so universal? Is it story spreading or everyone experiencing local floods?
Probably a mix of both. Cultural diffusion, yes, stories traveling with people. But also, think about the end of the last ice age, massive sea level rise, rivers changing course, lots of potential for shared experiences of major memorable local floods.
So those real environmental changes could have left a deep mark on early human memory and stories.
Absolutely. And from that scientific viewpoint, like we said, no global flood evidence, but plenty for big regional ones, especially in Mesopotamia around 2900 BC, maybe the Black Sea earlier.
Those seem like the likely historical kernels.
Exactly. Science suggests the Noah story, for instance, isn't literal history of a worldwide flood, but perhaps a theologically rich retelling of memories of those huge regional disasters.
Like that geologist Lawrence Collins quote, in your source, the Genesis flood story points to a large regional flood, not global.
Right. So science doesn't necessarily debunk the story, but it offers a more plausible geological background, suggests these myths grew from real events shaped by culture and belief over time.
It's a really fascinating meeting point for faith, history, and science.
It really is. It brings all these threads together.
Okay, so just to wrap things up a bit, we've looked at Noah's Ark through the different religious classes, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, seeing the shared roots but unique interpretations.
Uh-huh. Then we explored the historical side, the hunt for the Ark, Ararat versus Judy, the lack of solid proof but intriguing clues, alongside that strong archaeological evidence for major floods in Mesopotamia.
Right. And finally, the global picture, these flood myths everywhere, maybe stemming from real regional disasters passed down through powerful storytelling.
So, thinking about all the way these religious stories echo each other, the historical possibilities, the science pointing to real past environmental upheaval reflected in myths worldwide, it really poses a question for everyone listening, doesn't it?
Mhm.
What does this convergence tell us about how humans relate to, well, the divine maybe, but also just the raw power of nature? And how do these ancient tales of disaster and renewal still speak to us today, especially, now facing our own climate challenges?
That's definitely something to chew on. We really hope this deep dive encourages you to maybe look into those sources more, explore comparative mythology or the geology of these places.
Yeah, think about how these old stories might still resonate with our world now, our concerns about the environment, and maybe our search for meaning in the face of change. It's a story that clearly still has a lot to say.